is Matt Considine. So Matt is a member of the Springfield Telescope Makers, STM, the Antique Telescope Society, ATS, and a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. He is a curator of the Museum of the STMs and the treasurer of the ATS. So I think we got the right person for this. Anybody familiar with the spectrohelioscope at Stellafane? He's most closely associated with it. Matt lives in Randolph, Vermont, where he's the chair of the local healthcare organization, and he teaches finance part-time at Middlebury. So without further ado, I am really anxious to learn about Stellafane history. I am going to stop share and let Matt take over.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Okay. Can you see that okay?
See it nice.
Yep.
Great. All right. We have just find my controls again here, my window. All right. Okay. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to your meeting. I appreciate the opportunity. As Joe mentioned, I'm a member of the Springfield Telescope Makers and the curator of the museum there. So if anybody has been to Stellafane, you'll probably be familiar with Burt Willard, who founded the museum, and he's our historian. But in the last couple of years, I've taken over, just sort of worrying about some of the day-to-day stuff with respect to the museum and cataloging and things like that. In the event that anybody's not familiar with Stellafane, let me just give a brief description. Stellafane is the site of the Springfield Telescope Makers. It's where our clubhouse is. It's the name of the clubhouse and the property that we own in Springfield, Vermont. We started, began being built in 1923. It was, I believe, completed the basic building in 1924. But the club and the effort around telescope making goes back prior to that, a number of years prior to that, as a matter of fact. And I'll touch on that maybe a little bit when I'm talking about our founder, Russell Porter. But the reason for the convention, the reason for the history associated with the club is that we were really the first well-organized astronomical club and the first to put on these conventions and these gatherings starting in the mid-1920s. And that got quite a bit of publicity through the Scientific American publication with Albert Ingalls, who was an editor, came up and visited, and a couple of articles were written. And it seemed to coincide with a time when people were looking to make things and explore. And so a telescope was something that was generally out of the realm of a lot of people's experience. That not many people had them. But what Russell Porter and his band of followers, if you will, did was sort of show how you could make, how a person could make a telescope with a bit of effort, but not necessarily a whole lot in the way of expense. And so for the last 100 years or so, the organization and the convention have been at the vanguard of representing, I think, amateur efforts in astronomy, and certainly other organizations like yourselves and folks out in LA, et cetera, have come along and in a lot of cases do a much more expansive job than we do in terms of outreach and in terms of putting on programs. But our convention goes back a long time. There's a lot of history associated with it, and I'm going to try to share some of that with you today. So you'll notice on the slide here, I've noted the title as Stellafane History. What's up with that? So why that? Let's start out there. So in January 1924, from the club meeting minutes, there's this entry that the president presented to the club for its consideration the name Stellafane as the name for the club and the home recently constructed on Merritt's Hill. That was what was Breezy Hill, the name of Breezy Hill before it became really known as Breezy Hill, on land owned by Russell Porter. And the name was unanimously adopted at that time. Now, we all know Stellafane as the name, and that is in fact the correct name, or the legal name, the joining of the two words. But for a couple of years or so, it was actually referred to as Stellafane, and it's meant shrine to the stars. And Russell Porter and a couple of others owned this small plot of land that the clubhouse is currently sited on. But what did they do on that? We'll find that out in a moment. But who was Russell Porter? Russell Porter was probably first and foremost an artist and an explorer. And he spent a number of years in the late 1890s and the early 1900s, both being trained in architecture and in watercolor painting, but also periodically taking off to join Arctic explorations, which were a big deal at the time. Both North Pole and South Pole, North and South Poles were the subject of various expeditions of people from all different countries trying to explore the territory, trying to make it to the pole. Porter himself stuck to the North Pole, but did go on a couple of expeditions and essentially got marooned on one, if you want to think of it that way. Their boat or their ship got locked in ice, and they had to winter over up in Greenland. This photograph here is actually from an exhibit of his work that he had in Springfield after he returned to Springfield from living in Maine for a while. And what he did is, you can see on the wall, there's watercolors or pastels of some Eskimos in this particular case. I believe the center photograph is, or the center image is right in here, is a drawing or painting of the ship America, I believe, which was landlocked, ice-locked at one point. And then it's a little hard to make out in this photograph, but down here below at his level against the wall are photographs and drawings that he did related to architectural work. So prior to becoming known for his cutaway drawings, Russell Porter spent an enormous amount of time in the Arctic painting. He traveled around and he painted, he illustrated books, and he was quite accomplished. He also used that skill in an architectural capacity when he worked for an architect for a while after graduating from MIT in the early 1900s. But eventually he ended up out in Maine, out in Port Clyde, Maine. And he bought some land there, and he hoped to have an artist's colony. And he designed a number of little cottages, some of which are still standing and in use. And he had a house out there, and he met and married his wife there. But he was sort of always looking for like a next adventure, in a sense. And it was in the early 19-teens, around 1914, 1915, 1916, that you start to see that he is contributing articles to Popular Astronomy and showing illustrations of observations of the moon. And he had started at that point to become interested in astronomy, and he had started to make his own telescopes, having come across literature articles essentially at that time showing how one could grind a mirror and polish a mirror. But it wasn't really until he came across Reverend Ellison's book. Ellison wrote a small volume in the early 1920 that Porter really kind of coalesced his interests and his efforts in the optical space. And using that book by Reverend Ellison, he started to further develop his own interest and his abilities in making telescopes. He had become familiar with James Harkness in Springfield, who was not yet governor of Vermont, but would be a few years later. And Harkness himself had an interest in astronomy, and in 1912, I believe, had designed and patented the turret telescope, which, if you've ever been to the Harkness house in Springfield, you will see off to the left as you face the house. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a telescope that's mounted on a turret, and you observe from within inside the turret. This had enormous appeal to Porter because in his time in the Arctic, he suffered terribly from the cold and lost his hearing to some extent because of his exposure to the cold weather. So from then on, he was always interested in observing in comfort, if you will. His house in Port Clyde had a telescope that was mounted inside, although it was really difficult to use. In order to observe with it, you had to look up through the ceiling because the eyepiece was up above you. He sort of fixed that by flipping everything around with the turret telescope design, which was leveraging off of the work that Harkness had done. And he started to think about telescope designs where the eyepiece didn't move, or where you could sit and look down rather than having to look up. So in the early 1920s, up until 1990, or stepping back, in the early 19-teens, he really was starting to develop his interest and his expertise in not just telescope design, but also in conveying the methods and conveying the ideas through not just words, but also his drawings, leveraging his skills. Now, in 1919, he goes to Springfield, moves back to Springfield. Harkness convinces him to come back to Springfield. He grew up nearby, and he convinces him to take a job working for Harkness in Jones and Lamson, which was at that point one of the premier machine tool companies in Springfield. And what Porter does for Harkness is he helps design something called a screw comparator. And what they wanted to do at the time was to start to develop standards and quality control. And Jones and Lamson was developing machines that would create screw threads. Well, they wanted to be able to also help the end user know whether or not the product that they were putting out was good. And so they had something called an optical screw comparator, the Harkness designed, but he did it a lot with Porter's input. And it's essentially a projector. You can imagine an old style projector, and you put a part in front of it, and it casts an outline or a shadow onto a screen. And on that screen is a profile of what it is you are really trying to accomplish. And so very quickly, you could periodically put a screw or a threaded rod or whatever it is on a little platform and immediately see how well it fit the profile that you were trying to put out. And so this actually was quite a hit, and they were quite successful with this product. And Russell Porter became head of the optical division at Jones and Lamson. This is 1919 going into 1920. The economy wasn't doing great in 1920, and he was still bitten by the bug of making telescopes. So when he gets into Springfield, he starts talking to some of the folks that he's working with, and says, I'd like to show other people how to make a telescope. And he starts to develop a little group of people who are also interested in building telescopes. So that's the germ of the club, and ultimately of the amateur movement, what became the amateur telescope making movement in the United States. Porter, as I mentioned, had grown up around Springfield, so he had some land. And he had a couple of acres up on what was called Merritt's Hill, now called Breezy Hill. And before there was the clubhouse, they had this thing, which was called the Shack. And you can actually see it was called the Shack. No joke. And it was a getaway. There were a half dozen people or so and their friends, and they would go up to the hill and they would literally hang out, and they would cook and they would eat and they would socialize. And they weren't the only ones that did it. There was a cabin nearby, another property owner had, but it got people out of the valley. It got them up to some elevation. And you can't really see it in this picture very well, but back in the early 1900s, Vermont was 90% like pasture land. There was only like 10% forest, and it was heavily dairy and grazing lands. So from where they were on the hill, they could see all around. Certainly to the north toward Mount Ascutney, where we can still see today, barely, but all the trees and everything that you would see now if you went to Stellafane didn't exist then. As an aside, we've actually tried to find the exact spot for this shack, and we haven't been able to do it, even though we have a number of photographs from different angles of this particular spot. I've not been able to actually identify the rock outcropping that they used to perch their little patio on. Now, back down in the valley where he's working with his colleagues, they decide that they're going to get together, and they convince Governor Hartness, or James Hartness, the president of the company, later governor, to make some space available so that they can work on their telescopes after work. Now, Hartness, being an aficionado of astronomy, he readily agrees. And they are able to make use of a basement area in one of the old buildings in downtown. And they draw up plans for what will be a sort of a standard telescope that they'll all work on. And they had about 16 people, one woman, and about 15 men from different parts of the company, but also from outside the company. John Pierce was a teacher. Gladys Piper Skinner also didn't work at Jones and Lamson, but she knew people there. And so they all put in orders for glass, and they all started making their own telescope mirrors. And they all made slightly different sizes, but the whole idea was to make the sort of the same kind of a design, which they also made up a blueprint for, which is a Newtonian standard Newtonian telescope. I believe it was a 8-inch. Well, it was like an f6 or an f8 design, but they all had different mirror sizes that they were working on. Some were small, like 4-inch mirrors. Others were larger, 9-10-inch mirrors. But these two pages show the original plans that Porter drew up in 1920 for the use of the first telescope making class. They posted an ad, in a sense, in the halls, and we still have that, suggesting there was going to be a class in telescope making. And in one of the buildings at Jones and Lamson, they had a classroom with a chalkboard, and that's where they did sort of the theory work. This shows a picture of one of the members, Charlie Long, who is holding the telescope that he made, which was a small 4-inch, I think f6 Newtonian. Long was a very interesting guy. He did most of the work, the machining work, on the Porter turret telescope. All that iron and metal work was actually done down by almost all of it was done down in Jones and Lamson, and they had the main rings cast somewhere else, but all the machining work was done at Jones and Lamson, and Charlie Long is the guy that primarily did that. This is a picture which you all probably have seen, or if you've been to Stellafane, you've seen, but over on the left is the first class photo. This is the first group that got together. There's a couple of folks missing and didn't make the photograph. but they are standing outside of Jones and Lamson. Well, we now know now we know they're standing outside of Jones and Lamson. For a long time, it wasn't known where this photograph was taken, but I managed to figure out the spot. Over on the right here, you'll see a picture that shows their first exhibition, where they had completed a number of instruments, or at least the tube assemblies. I kind of wonder how many optics were really in this thing, but they had a exhibit at the Springfield Fair in September of 1920. And I don't have a larger view of this, but there's a number of interesting little instruments in this photograph, as well as pictures of some of the tools and the things that they were working on, and a couple of pieces of Porter's artwork that's now at this point almost exclusively astronomy related. Just for the record, this is where that photograph was taken. I managed to find it. This is where Jones and Lamson was, where the building was, across from what is now the police station. As you drive into Springfield, if you've gone to Stellafane, you would most likely have gone past this building. It would have been on your right, and beyond that, there would have been the Black River. This past year, or within the past year, this building has been torn down, so this site now no longer exists. I did manage to convince them, though, to save me some of the bricks from this area. So we're going to have some bricks in the museum at some point that commemorate that first class photo. In 1924, I mentioned they completed building the clubhouse. If anybody has been up there, you'll see that it's doesn't look anything like this. They don't have windows on here. They don't have doors, and most likely it is not painted. And we'll get to the whole issue of why they painted it pink near the end. But this is a photograph of a couple of photographs of the building actually being put up. It doesn't show at the end. They put a kitchen on later, and then right over here where my cursor is, they also eventually added on a little workshop. That's it's now our kitchen, part of the kitchen, but it was originally a workshop. The local reporting, local newspapers were eager, or at least seemed very willing. I don't know how eager they were, but they were very willing to report on the club's doings. And for years, starting in 1920, they right up and through the 1940s and certainly into the 1950s, they would report on not just the club's convention, but also on a number of any other meetings, or if they had if the club had somebody come and visit from New York, for example, they would run a little article that talked about telescope makers play host to New York writer, or something along those lines. So there was a lot of recognition of what the club was doing, probably because I assume they wrote the articles for the newspaper, and the newspaper was probably only too happy to print something that they didn't have to write. But there was quite a bit of local following, and that certainly helped me trying to figure out, what went on with in the early years of the club's history, because our own records we have our club records and we have our minutes, but maybe it wouldn't come as a surprise that over 100 years things go missing and records seem to be incomplete. As an example of this, we have a beautiful desk that's in our clubhouse, and we know virtually nothing about when that was built or who made it. I actually know who made it, but we don't know any of the details around it. There's no references to it in the club minutes. So there's a lot of little interesting bits of history that I'm still working on, kind of digging out, and I'll go into that an example of that a little bit later. Solar observing has always been something that the club is interested in, or at least Porter was interested in, and other club members were interested. And I mentioned that Albert Ingalls helped popularize the telescope making efforts of Porter and his club members with a couple of Scientific American articles. This is the cover of a November 1925 issue, and it shows an image of the sun being projected onto a screen. This is actually how they would view the sun in the clubhouse. What they did is, this is a representation of the attic area of the pink clubhouse. And what they used to do is have the solar mirror down on a pier on the ground about 75 feet away. And they had up at the top of the clubhouse, outside the window, they had a little steering flat where they could direct the sunbeam onto the primary mirror. And then that mirror, which has a 75-foot focal length, would shine an image of the sun onto a white board that was up in the attic. And so people could be up in the attic and they could look at this enormous picture of the sun, as projection of the sun. So this is actually a rendition of how they actually did it. This is a photograph of the solar mirror. I don't know where the pier is long gone, but we do have the mirror and the mirror cell, and every few years we break it out. Joe mentioned earlier that I'm probably most closely associated with the spectrohelioscope that we have at Stellafane, and that's sort of like the next step up in solar observing. So I can talk about that a little bit later if we have some time and if there's any interest. Now, I mentioned earlier that Porter, he didn't like the cold. Well, you're in Vermont, dude. Why didn't you go to California? And he did ultimately go to California, but he really wanted to observe in comfort. And there's two bits of evidence of this. Is this telescope over here on the left, in the left image, which is a polar Cassegrain. And one can be inside the clubhouse and look down through an eyepiece and essentially see the planets or whatever else this mirror down here can steer into the eyepiece. But it's set up optically as a Cassegrain telescope. And over here on the right is the Porter Turret telescope. This is a photograph shown before they had put in the stairs. Right now, they've just got some. At this point, they've just got some wooden stairs up here. But this is the long turret that, if you've been to Stellafane, you've no doubt seen. But what most people don't really know is this other thing off to the other side. What's up with that, right? And you would think that, well, maybe it's a counterweight, but it's not big enough to be a counterweight. Originally, Porter envisioned having another telescope over here, and this was going to be a double turret instrument. And you would be able to look through both instruments, not at the same time, but you would be able to aim them and look at presumably one object with two different configurations. Conceivably, you could have you could have done something different with the second telescope, I guess. But if you think about it, this main telescope is already f/17. And what he was envisioning over here was a Cassegrain telescope, which was also going to be a long focal ratio. So you sort of had two instruments that were pretty much doing the same thing. It's not clear what the utility was of that. And I think that's the reason why they never actually put in the second telescope. But for a little while, this was referred in the press to as an observatory that was going to have a double telescope. And most people aren't familiar with that, aren't aware of that. But it never saw the light of day, as far as we can tell. But you can imagine, if you've been there, you now are you observe inside this this building, so you're protected from the elements. And if you're using the polar Cassegrain, you're inside the clubhouse, where you're not only protected from the elements, but it's probably warm in there, because we do have a pretty good wood stove in there that they would have running. Now, another iteration of comfort is found in the Springfield mount, which Porter designed. And the Springfield mount is named after Springfield, obviously. But what it is an optical setup where the eyepiece doesn't move. And what you see here is a picture of Oscar Marshall, who was one of the club members, with his telescope, his version of the Springfield mount. He had a very long tube assembly requiring a tall pier and a little bit of a platform to sit on. But as long as you didn't, as long as you watched your head when the thing was getting swung around, all you needed to really deal with was field rotation. But you could stay in one position, and that would be very convenient if you're looking to do drawings, say of Mars or some other object over an extended period of time. You could set yourself up in some reasonable comfort and not have to move around as the target moved throughout the night. Let's see, we've got the first gathering. So 1925, I've got 1925 up here, not 1926. What's up with that? Well, the first convention, formal convention, was actually 1926. But they actually had a get-together in 1925, and this is a photograph from that. We've got a couple of club members here. We've got Russell Porter down here in the lower right. We have Everett Redfeld, who is the chef up here. We have Oscar Fulham over here on the far right. We have Roy Lyon here, another club member. But we have also we have John Pierce, and we have a couple of gentlemen, one from both from the U.S. Geological Survey, I think it was called at the time, and they had been invited up to observe and to check out the site. And there were a few other people that joined that crew at that same time in 1925, and that was technically the first sort of formalized gathering where some people were invited up that weren't relatives or kind of members of some sort of inner family, but it wasn't a convention. That had to wait until 1926. But here you see the picture from 1925. At this point, the clubhouse is maybe a year and a half old, and so it looks like it's in pretty good shape. And it's but a black and white photograph. You can't really tell what color is this thing painted. Now, in 1922, starting in 22, but the seed of the idea was planted earlier than that. Porter had wanted to come up with a so-called garden telescope. And he had started designing one, and in 1922, Jones and Lamson started manufacturing them. They only did that for about 2 years, and as best we can tell, they made maybe 65 of them or so. And there were a number of prototypes. There's different photographs in the museum that show different versions of the idea that Porter was playing around with. This here is a studio photograph of probably the most developed of the prototypes, but it's a little different. It's got some adjustments on the feet that aren't present in most of the originals. And it may be that this is actually serial number 1. They all changed, their details changed for a little while as they were being developed. Actually, they kept changing even toward the end of the product run. But I've been able to identify this as either the last of the prototypes or possibly version serial number 1. It did also serve as the model, as you can see over here. This photograph and the scope served as a model for a garden telescope watercolor that Porter did, that for a long time we had hanging in the clubhouse, and at some point went missing. And we'll leave it at that. We don't know where it is, but if anybody ever happens to come across or know the whereabouts of this watercolor, we would love to have it back, no questions asked, and would certainly appreciate any heads up if anybody ever comes across it. But the Porter Garden Telescope was the only telescope that Jones and Lamson put out there. It cost as much as a car did at the time, and so it was very expensive. And it was only bought by the well-to-do folks. They advertised it in Home and Garden and architectural magazines. And like I said, they only made about 65 of them or so. And there's maybe 2 dozen known to exist. Most of them are in museums now. But it's a beautiful bit of artwork, if nothing else. It's a little awkward to use as a telescope, because you kind of tend to get your head stuck in the light path. Your mirror's down here and your eyepiece is up here, and obviously it's an open tube assembly here, so it takes a bit of getting used to. You need to get used to it for a little while before you can figure out what you're doing. Now, I mentioned earlier, associated with a spectrohelioscope, and might wonder, hey, why a spectrohelioscope? Well, first of all, what is a spectrohelioscope? And you can think of it as a telescope that can look at the sun in any wavelength, any of the visible wavelengths. And it's three parts. It's a telescope that's mounted horizontally, which feeds a spectroscope, which is also mounted horizontally. And then there's usually, in our case, a couple of rotating prisms that help build up the image in your eyes. And if you're familiar with the old television technology of quickly scanning a line across a tube, your eye does not see that flicker rate usually, and so you see instead of different lines, you see a sort of a full image. Same principle is at work here, the idea of persistence of vision. And originally the club was going to have a spectroscope in the early 1930s. They never got around to it. I found one against all odds and had it. The University of Pennsylvania gave it to me, and I turned around and donated it to the club with the provision that we actually put it up in a proper observatory and actually use it as it was intended to be used. And that's what we're doing now. We're now working out the imaging workflow so we can get pictures out of it, because it was only intended to be a visual instrument. And so it's been a bit of a challenge getting nice images out of it, but we're getting closer and closer. So hopefully I'll have something for that to present on that at Stellafane. We've had a number of notable folks that are club members and that have helped us out. Former Vermont Governor Joe Johnson was a club member, and here he is helping to spackle part of one of the museum rooms when that was first developed in the 1970s. I mentioned Governor Hartness he's an honorary club member. He was governor. But also Ralph Flanders was a club member who was a U.S. Senator. And we've had other club members who have been involved in the state legislature. For example, Carlton Damon was an early club member, was a representative of Springfield in the 1930s. So we've had a number of club members who have kind of gone on to do other things of note. And we've also had a number of famous people visit Stellafane. We've had Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered Pluto. And we've had a number of other folks come through, astronauts and other scientists to give keynote addresses. So it's a fascinating club to kind of be around, and the convention's often fascinating because you sort of never know who you might run into. We have not had a governor show up in quite a while, but that might happen. I'm gonna work on that for our centenary meeting next year. We'll see if we get anywhere with that. Now on just a couple of lighter topics. Food. The club likes to eat. I mentioned earlier that Porter and his friends would go up to Merritt's Hill and they would socialize. And the club, even at its early founding days, when you read some of the early meeting stories or reports on the meetings, a good part of the reporting will always be on the food that was consumed. And so we've got in various places, there's these recipes that are tucked away in like cupboards on the back of on an old piece of paper stuck on the back of a door. And so I've got one here, which is their oyster stew recipe, which was supposedly famous. But you read it and kind of go, wow, it seems kind of bland. And while they ate a lot and while they enjoyed their food, I would not necessarily call them the best chefs in the world. I'm pretty sure a lot of us could find ways of spicing up some of these recipes. But there you go. There's a vintage oyster stew recipe. You don't want to know what they did with beans in the back in the day. Now, if you've been in the clubhouse above the fireplace, you'll see a cast iron monkey sitting there looking through a telescope. You might go, what's the dude? What's up with him? Well, this is Rufus, and he is actually a counterweight. I've actually found a photograph recently of a telescope, and he was used as a counterweight on the telescope. What's interesting is that the photograph I found shows a different version of this. It's the exact same casting, but it's a second version, because this thing has been in the clubhouse for a long time, and the photograph I know that I saw was only taken recently. So there was at least two of them. And so I started looking into that, and I believe that this is the club mascot for the Pittsfield, Massachusetts telescope makers, which was headed up by a guy named Wally Everest, who for a long time had the record for the most number of Stellafanes attended. He started at the very first one, and up until he made every single one of them, I think, until he passed away. He made every one of them, at least up until the 1950s. And I believe that, and this is just a guess, but I believe that they had a mascot, like we have the little man at Stellafane. He came up with this monkey, which was the mascot of a social club that he and a number of others were part of as employees for General Electric down in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So this is all story. I'm trying to figure out how much of it is accurate, but it's the story I'm piecing together. And it's got the monkey's got a little bit of a more history to it than we all thought. But in any event, in case anybody asks, this was a counterweight for a decorative counterweight for a Newtonian telescope in the 1930s. And let's see. So let's go to why pink. This is the clubhouse, and that's obviously the color it's painted these days. A lot of people call it the bubblegum pink. I wouldn't disagree with that. The question is, what is it, and why is it that color? First of all, there's two stories. One is that we were donated paint, and they mixed red and white, and this is what they came up with. That might be true. I'm not sure of it, though. A different story that I've heard is that Russell Porter wanted it to be colored what they called spruce gum white. And if you go up to Maine and you look at the spruce trees, the tar, the resin that comes out is actually kind of a dusty rose color. And it's very Maine looking. And this clubhouse was designed by Porter and is in keeping with the style of his cottages and things that he designed out in Maine. So I actually think that the original color was much more of a dusty rose than it was a bright pink. But over the years, as they tried to repaint the clubhouse and figure out, what to put on it and how to freshen it up, eventually the pink got more and more and more pink until it's now what you see today. And someday, if I get up enough political capital and I feel strongly enough about it, I'll try to argue that we ought to go back to a more muted pink color, which is evidenced in a very few 1940s color photographs that we've seen. But I think that it was actually not quite as bright a pink, but it was intended to be something not not quite a normal white color. And it's a color that we've all grown to love and we're associated with. So truth be told, we'll never change that. So, but that's the reason why it's pink. Most people still want to believe the story that we just had red and white and mixed it together, and that's what they came up with. And that's not really in keeping with the way Porter thought. He wouldn't have left something like that to chance. So that's just my own personal opinion. So I'm coming up on my time here. I want to leave some time for questions, but I want to leave with this slide here. A little plug. Convention is July 28th to the 31st. You can register for it at this URL. You'll see the web page for the club is behind me here on the screen. And you can register if you go to stellafane.org. You'll over on that side, right there. You'll see a link to the registration. If you care to join us, we would love to have you up on the hill. I know that Joe was saying that you usually all have a table up there, and so I'm confident that you'll be represented, but the more the merrier. So that's my presentation. I hope you found it, hopefully if you found it somewhat informative, I hope it was at least a little amusing and a little bit entertaining. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Matt, thank you, first of all. And I guess I'll start is the spectrohelioscopes look so big and so complex. What drives that complexity and size?
Well, the challenge with the spectrohelioscope is that the telescope is a singlet telescope, right? 3-inch objective, but it's an 18-foot focal length. And so it has to throw an image of the sun onto a slit. It's would be in this drawing right above the observer's head. And then the mirrors, the collimating mirrors and the camera mirror, or the viewing mirror, if you will, those are 13-foot focal lengths. So the footprint of this whole thing is north of 30 feet. And then you add a couple of feet here and there for a variety of for just some space, and what you have is a 35, 36 foot open optical path telescope or instrument, and you have to have the long focal length to get the 2-inch image of the sun onto the slit. And then you need to match up your focal ratios on the spectroscope side as near as possible with the telescope. So those mirrors have are f50-52. They're about three inches or so, and 13-foot focal length. So we got 2 of them, and then you got a diffraction grating, which is a plane diffraction grating. So it's that optics that dictates this particular the size of this thing, and the fact that it's mounted horizontally. There are other variations that are mounted vertically, but then it's just still a long optical path. It's just in the other direction. The advantage is that you've got any wavelength you want to select from. If you only are sure, if you're sure that you only want to look at H alpha, then you can buy a nice little. Now you can buy a nice little hydrogen alpha filter. But back in the 1930s, they didn't have that. This was the only thing this was as good as it got. Now in the 1940s and then into the 1950s with thin film technology, very specific wavelength specific filters were developed. And so the instrument became obsolete because if you only wanted to work in 1 or 2 wavelengths, it was just a lot more practical to spend the money on filters rather than real estate.
So with this scope, do you actually see an image of the sun or like a spectrum?
Both. If you stop the prisms from spinning, or you step off to the side, you can see a spectrum. But if you look through the spinning prisms, you see you see part of the sun. It's a narrow field of view, but that was by intent. It was meant to study sunspots and solar flares and prominences and things like that. But now what we're doing with the imaging is we're hooking a camera up and we're scanning across the sun's the surface of the sun, and then building up an image as we scan across and stitching it all together to get a wider field of view. So next year when you're up, not this year, we'll have to take you on a tour of it. But you can also stop by one of our club meetings someday. We can have you up to Stellafane, and I'll be happy to give you a tour. If you want to get a group of people together, we could look through the spectrohelioscope. Doesn't have to be a convention.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'm sure there's a bunch. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I've been up once for one day only, and I'm considering to try to go up to camp out up there. Are they gonna have the cafeteria open for breakfast and lunch, dinner, that type of thing, or?
Uh, the cafeteria on near the pavilion on the hill, or down at the Hartness House? You're
Either
talking
one.
about camping out. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think they're going to. I believe they're going to, but I don't know the answer to that. I'm kitchen duty is not my it's not in my wheelhouse. But I believe the intent is we have a cook shed, a building set that we put up in the last 2 years to specifically for serving meals. So I believe it's going to be up and running. Yeah.
Yeah, when you register, you're asked if you want to get a meal on Saturday night or not, which they've done in the past. So they looks like they're still taking reservations for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't. I would assume that they're going to have lunch and breakfast available too, but I don't know the answer to that specifically.
They've had 3 meals. They have pretty much every year I've been there, as far as I can remember.
Mhm. Yeah, food we take seriously.
Well, the cafeteria area, whatever you call it, has been vastly improved over the years, and it's much appreciated.
You go on the Stellafane site under everything else, there's a little menu. You can see the webcams. There's a link to some webcams. And I think they got a webcam that looks out onto that area. So if anybody is not familiar with it, with the site, you can do a little tour.
Any other questions for Matt?
Well, I'll just, I have a comment. I've been going up to Stellafane for 40 plus years, and I learned a couple of new things from your talk tonight. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for your support. 40 years, you're one of the longer term attendees. It's great to hear. Anyone else?
Going once? Other questions? Go ahead and unmute. All right. Matt, I want to thank you very much. This has been good. I learned so much about Stellafane or Stellarfane. And I'm going to try to find that monkey the next time I go up. I don't think I noticed. Maybe I'll go through some old photos.
If you're looking at the if you're standing in front of the fireplace, you look on the wall just to your over to your right.
All right, I'm going to look for that monkey. Get a picture.
There you go.
The Stellafane monkey.
Right.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Sure.
And you're welcome to stay. But you don't have to at this point.
Yep.
We'll go to our business meeting.
I appreciate that. I think I will drop off. I've got a glass of wine waiting for me over at the house. So I thank you very much. I appreciate the audience. I appreciate the questions. I hope, like I said, that some of this was new, and hopefully it was stimulating. But thank you very much. I really appreciated the opportunity to share a little bit of our history with you, and I'll look forward to maybe seeing some of you up there this year. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks.
All right, let me find my controls here and see if I can. Okay.
Very good.
All right. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Let me find actually PowerPoint. Get this running. And I am going to, let me see, find my Says screen 2. Do you see?
There you go. Yep, we can see it now.
Gotcha.
Joe?